Hi everybody, welcome to Lord of the Reads. Am I glowing? There's so many lights. I feel like I have to look straight at the camera because if I look in that direction, or look in that direction, or even if I look up, I'm blinded. Okay, there's so many lights plugged in, we might blow a fuse. We're gonna try to get through this before we blow a fuse. So, in today's video, I'm going to do something that I haven't seen before. If you haven't seen last week's video, I'll link it somewhere. I don't know where it's going to be, but I'll link it somewhere. I did my January TBR game. So, I have my January TBR books, and I have read the first chapters from each of my books, and I'm going to be giving you my first impressions. I have notes down here, so if I look down a lot, that's because they're there. So I picked 6 books, and I'm only going to be doing 4 of them, because I had a nonfiction, which I'm not really sure how I would do a first impressions of a nonfiction. So I just decided to keep with my fiction. And the other book was a graphic novel, which I didn't know how to split into chapters easily. So we're only going to do the other 4. Let's get started with the first book. The first book on my list is Robin Hood by Paul Creswick. And I read this one, the first chapter of this first. And it was a bit intimidating just because it is a classic, so it's denser. And it was very nostalgic actually because I mentioned this in my favorite books of 2020 video, that this was the first year that I started reading YA and middle grade actually. And up until that point, the only thing I read was classics. So it was really nostalgic of when I read only classics. So it was a denser book, but not as dense as most classics that I've read actually. Definitely not as dense as books like anything by Charles Dickens. So that was a really nice surprise. Another thing that I learned while I read this was that Disney is very misleading. While reading this, I was imagining what happened in the Disney adaptation of this book. It was very misleading. So, it starts in his childhood, Robin Hood's childhood, which I might be remembering it wrong, but I don't remember that in the Disney adaptation. So that was one thing that was different. It started with his childhood, and immediately you could tell a lot about him based on how he acted as a child. And the whole family dynamic was really interesting. You didn't actually see any of his family in the Disney adaptation, so that was fun to see. But you could tell in the book immediately that he was super prideful, which he was also that in the movie, but it was super interesting to read about. He was super, super prideful. And that was really interesting to see as he was a child and how boastful he was at that time. Also, the first chapter left off at a bit of a cliffhanger, which I guess most writers do at the beginning of the first chapter. They leave you off on a cliffhanger so that you'll continue through the other chapters. But that was really interesting. Okay, so the second book on my list is The Toll by Neal Shusterman. I realized that while I was editing my January TBR game, I realized that I didn't really explain anything about these books. So I'm going to explain it to you now. So The Toll is the 3rd book in the Arc of the Scythe trilogy. So I can't really tell you about this one or the second book. So I'm going to start with the first one and tell you what that one's about. And the basic, how the world is set up. So it's a sci-fi, fantasy, I think that's it. But it's sci-fi and fantasy. And it's based in a world, it's in the current world, but in the future. And death has been completely conquered. There is no one can die of natural causes, there are no diseases, nothing like that. And in order to keep the population down, they had to hire scythes to come and kill off people to keep the population down. And the world is run by something called a thunderhead, which is the cloud just advanced with artificial intelligence. And so it runs the world. And the first book you follow Citra and Rowan, who are becoming scythe apprentices. They don't want to, but they've been called by a scythe to do that. So this was, the first chapter was interesting compared to the first two books. The first book was super fast-paced, and the second book was also very fast-paced. But this one started off a little slower, which was fine, but I was not expecting it. Another thing that was really interesting about this book was the diary entries at the beginning of each chapter. So in the first two books, Scythe and Thunderhead, at the beginning of each chapter there was a diary entry. So the Scythes always have to write daily diary entries. So at the beginning of each chapter, they would start off with one of those. And in the Thunderhead, they had like small little paragraphs that of some of the things that the Thunderhead thought. And that was one of the things that I loved about the books, because it gave a little bit of context, or added a little bit of information, or helped you pull certain things, certain scenes in the story together. And that was one of the things that was really good about the whole series that I really enjoyed. This chapter also led up to a big cliffhanger. Actually, the second book also, the end of that book was a gigantic cliffhanger. And this one also just kind of goes straight into another cliffhanger. And I have absolutely no clue where the story could be taken or what's going to happen. So, the next book on this list is Catching Fire by Suzanne Collins. I read The Hunger Games about 3 weeks ago, and this was one of the books that I really wanted to put on my January TBR. So, when I read the first chapter, the first thing that stuck out immediately, which was actually true about the first book also, was the really interesting family dynamic. The main character, Katniss, has a mother and a sister, and her father died in an accident. And she pretty much has to take care of her family because her mother can't really work. So she is the main provider for her family. And that was a really interesting dynamic in the first book, was seeing her relationship with her mother because her mother couldn't really provide for the family. That was really interesting to read about in this book. The other thing, I can't really explain it too much because it would give away the end of the first book. But another thing that was really interesting was the way that things were juggled in this book between the friends and the romances and the people that the main character hates. Like, that was super interesting how they overlapped and they were balanced in the book, which made the book, actually, the first book, really interesting to read. And I'm sure that it's going to be really good in this one. Also, this book left off at a huge cliffhanger also. That was really surprising. I expected this book to go in an entirely different place than it is going. So, I really can't wait to see where it goes. The first book was about Katniss, and she had to fight in the Hunger Games, which is a game where the children of these districts have to have their names drawn. And if their name is drawn, they have to go to an arena where they fight to the death. And she goes. And I was expecting this book to go in an entirely different place from where it went. So I cannot wait to continue this and see where it actually ends up going. Okay, so the last book on this list is The Knife of Never Letting Go by Patrick Ness. I started this book about a year ago, I think, and I got through it halfway. And I don't actually remember why I put it down. And I just really wanted to read it because the synopsis sounded really interesting. So it's about this village or this town and it was taken over. I want to say aliens. It's super confusing. I want to say that it's aliens, but it might not be. It might just be a different species of humans? Something like that. Anyway, but they came to attack the Earth. And what happened was they got a disease. And it killed off all the women and left the men to where they could hear each other's thoughts. And it was this endless drowning noise. And then those aliens died. Something happened. There might have been a war. This book, the synopsis, was really interesting. Slightly confusing, though. So I'm not completely sure. I'm doing a terrible job at describing it. But that's really because I have no idea what actually happened. From what I'm piecing together, there were aliens, got a disease, all the women died, and then now the men can hear each other's thoughts. I'm doing a really bad job at explaining it because I don't really understand what exactly happened. That's just what I'm piecing together. And now you're in this town and you follow this boy. And that's all I know. You follow a boy who lives in this world where people can hear each other's thoughts. Besides that, I have absolutely no clue what else happens. So, in the beginning, he's just kind of walking around. There hasn't been a whole lot of action. But he finds a break in the noise. It's like this endless hole where there is no sound, or there's no, where he can't hear anyone's thoughts, so there's some kind of break in the noise. Once again, it's really confusing because I don't really understand. But one of the things that was actually super interesting about this book, about reading it physically, not so much about the story, but the actual physically reading it, was the font actually changes between between the actual writing and then people's thoughts. It's really a drastic change, which actually makes it really interesting to read. It's a really good physical reading experience. Also, I've never read a book where this happened, but the author misspells words on purpose to show the how uneducated the main character is, which I've never actually seen someone do that before. But I thought that it was really interesting while I was reading it, and it actually, knowing that he's uneducated like that, and the showing that actually helps carry the story along and makes it really interesting. It's also super fast-paced. Like, the first chapter went by so fast. Super fast-paced and interesting. It's very gripping. Also slightly, disturbing. Not because of anything that happens, just like the setting and everything just makes it slightly unnerving to read about. And then straight from the beginning, the characters are super well built. I mean, we've only followed one character, but he's really well built for only having read a chapter of it. Like, you can tell what his personality is and what he wants and who he is just based on that first chapter, which is something that I actually haven't seen in a lot of books. So, that was my first impressions from my January TBR. I really hope you enjoyed. I know I didn't explain anything very well because I am only in the first chapter, so there wasn't a whole lot of explaining, but I hope that you could get something out of it. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed. Let me know down in the comments below what you're currently reading and what you think about it, because January's already started, so if you are reading something, please let me know what you're thinking about it. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!